the Incurables with Dennis Paparak. And I'm going to bring on this fella here. This fella who knows everything about everything. Music. Absolutely brilliant, this fella. Derek Shelmerdine. Hiya, Derek.
Hi, Frank. Good to be back, mate. Hi, Anthony.
Oh, thank you.
Good evening, Derek. Nice to see you. I caught your show with Frank the other month, which we were talking about in Steve Marriott was part of the show, and you talking about all sorts of stuff. It's a pleasure to meet. Looking forward to tonight.
Yeah, it should be fun. I mean, Phil Spector's a great topic. It really is.
Yeah.
And Valley says, hello, Derek.
Hi.
My little Valley. Hello, Derek. She's waiting for a lad to come, actually. Her son, Jack. And, hang on. Some bad names here, boys. Dementia Runner. I love your YouTube videos, Frank. I've learned so much about our lovely home city. Stay with us. And you'll be learning more in the second hour. And you'll be learning loads now about Mr. Phil Spector, because this is what Derek's going to discuss now about this great producer. No matter how you look at this man, Phil Spector, one of the greatest of all producers of the music. And before we start on him, Derek, I'm going to say this. When he produced some John Lennon's, the album.
Yep.
I said this, believe it or not, I said this to Benny King himself. I said this. I said, I was calling him Benny, and he said, excuse me, and he said, excuse me, and he went away to get he only drank water, and he went away to get a drink of water, and Percy Sledge said, it's Ben E. I said, it's not Benny. He said, no. He said, and honestly, he came back. I went, I'm sorry, Ben E. I said, I'm calling you Benny. He said, presidents have called me Benny, so it's no exception. What a gentleman. But anyway, I said to him about Stand By Me. I don't know what your take is. Don't tell me yet. Just let me finish on this. And I said, the best cover version of Stand By Me was by John Lennon. And he went, yes. That's what he said. So
yeah. It is a great cover.
It is. So what do you think, Derek? Before you start, Derek has a book out called Rock and Roll Unraveled. I've got it here somewhere. I can't reach over to get it. And it's like an encyclopedia. It's like that. It's like an encyclopedia. It's absolutely amazing. And if you just purchase it. It's absolutely brilliant. If you like your music, you like your bands, and I'm talking about every band. I'm talking about everything. It's all in Liverpool. Rock and Roll Unraveled, and you can see it there at the bottom of the screen. So go ahead. I'm sorry about this. Funny enough, Phil Spector produced a Ramones album, but it's not the best. It's not the best. The band hated it. That's what Gary Rigby says. Okay, Phil Spector, tell us all about him and how he started and what happened.
Yeah, I mean, the Ramones gig comes well towards the end of what we're going to be talking about. It's lots of interesting stuff he's done. I think you could fairly say that Phil Spector is unique. I mean, one of the most famous record producers, and I think there's Wall of Sound, his most famous era. First half of the 60s. What was interesting, I'm very much from that era. And you didn't talk about the new Ronette single, the new Crystal single. You talked about the new Phil Spector single. And to put him into context, how important he is, if you like, to the industry, he was inducted into only the 4th rock and roll inductions for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1989. The first one was in 86. And he was inducted the same year as Otis Redding and the Rolling Stones and the Temptations. start right at the beginning. He was born in 1939 in New York, and his wall of sound was very much multi-layering instruments. But the irony is, he was a massive fan of mono. And in 91, he produced the sort of 4 CDs retrospective, and included in the box was a pin, a badge that said "Back to Mono." When you think, the whole essence of Spector is he's got a massive sound. I think that's a lovely little touch. And when he was only 9 years old, he had quite an impact on him. His dad committed suicide, Ben Spector, and on his tombstone, the father's tombstone, it's inscribed, "To know him was to love him." And if that sounds familiar, it's because the first single he ever had a hit with was called "To Know Her Is to Know Him Is to Love." Sorry, "To Know Him Is to Love Him." Just changed the tense. That was the Teddy Bears. That was in May of '58, 3 years before the war.
Did the female sing that as well?
Well, there was a female. The female voice in that was Annette Kleinbard, and she later found her own fame as Carol Connors. So hers was really, if you like, the lead vocal, I think.
Yeah.
Spector played guitar, sang backing vocals. He also produced it, and what it was actually released as the B-side. The A-side was "Don't You Worry, My Little Pet." So obviously there's some Newcastle blood in him there somewhere. And the DJs just loved the B-side, "To Know Him to Love Him." They flipped it, and it gave him his first hit record. Number 1, which is not bad for a debut single in America. Number 2 over here. And after that, he decided, he obviously liked the production side, so he became a house producer at Atlantic Records. He was there from about 1960 and 61. And that's where he met Lester Sill. He worked with him. Lester Sill's the guy we'll talk about in a few minutes, when he formed his own record label for the Wall of Sound, Crystals, Ronettes, Righteous Brothers and stuff. That was the Phillies label. And that's where the name came from, Phil and Les, basically. But he was also very involved with Lieber and Stoller. And he was a session guitarist. And he worked with people like Benny King and the Coasters. And apparently he does the guitar solo on the Drifters on Broadway. And then he started doing production gigs with Atlantic Records. He worked with people like Ray Peterson, Karina Karina, Curtis Lee, Pretty Little Angel Eyes. I mean, that's quite a classic. And he worked with a couple of real R&B classic acts at the time. I mean, Laverne Baker and Ruth Brown. And Ruth Brown was the biggest star that Atlantic had at the time. In fact, her nickname was the house that Ruth built. And I think it's a bit of a play on the Babe Ruth baseball days, because he had a similar kind of nickname. And he recorded
He was
actually
a baseball player, wasn't he, Babe Ruth?
He
He was
yeah.
a baseball player, yeah.
Yeah, apparently he's an absolute legend. He still holds all kinds of records, apparently. I mean, I don't know much about the sport, but I know that if you're into baseball, Babe Ruth is one of the heroes of the genre.
The game, yeah.
But he recorded the first, produced the first version of Twist and Shout. Again, he's still
By the Isley Brothers.
That's part of the story. What happened was,
I'm sorry. I just go on, carry on. I'm sorry. No.
I was just going to say, I mean, at Atlantic, he recorded it with a group called the Top Notes, and that was released as a B-side. And the guy who wrote it, Burt Burns, not very happy at all with the Phil Spector version. So what happened was he took it to Wand and record label and the Isley Brothers. And Burt Burns, as well as being a writer, he's a major producer. And he produced the Isley Brothers at Wand, and that gave the Isley Brothers their first big hit. That tends to be, I think, why the Isley Brothers is often thought of as the original version. But technically, the Top Notes preceded that by several months. And of course, the Beatles version is very, very well known, and it's one of the real popular ones, I think, from the early days.
There's some wonderful early Beatles material, which obviously they revered what Phil was doing, because you mentioned before to know him is to love him. I'm sure that was on the Decca audition tapes for the Beatles with
It was.
McCartney singing it, yeah.
Yeah, the
And then-
Beatles used to play it in the early days.
Yeah, so the parallels between their careers, long before they met, really were quite profound, weren't they? The Beatles' version of "Twist and Shout" was just brilliant, and then onwards to 1969, where Phil worked with the Beatles in their twilight years. Just brilliant.
Well, do you know the Gale bands at the
Yeah.
time, Phil Spector. Now, I've always wondered, well, I always thought, not wondered, I always thought that he actually pulled them together. You know, say like he's seen three singers, yeah, you three get together and give us a song, that sort of thing. You know, he made them.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, did he? Yeah, all I'm glad about that.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, there's a little story coming up in about 30 seconds that shows just how interchangeable Phil Spector's acts were. And we're now at the Phillies record label. This is the Wall of Sound. Phillies was the label released in America. They were released mostly on London American and other associated labels in the UK. But really, we just stick really with the American stuff. Because it is very much an American sound. I mean, the Crystals were his first band. They released their first hit, "There's No Other Like My Baby." That was the first ever single on Spector's label, and it gave him a number 20. And then they followed that up in April of 62, with a song called "Uptown," much better known, and that got them into just under the top 10. And this is where it gets interesting. The follow-up to Uptown, in the July of 62, the Crystals released a song called "He Hit Me," and in brackets, "and it felt like a kiss," close brackets. Now, as you can imagine, the critics and the public took a fairly dim view of this and how that song came about. It was a Jerry Goffin, Carole King song, Goffin and King, big brill building songwriters. Little Eva, Do the Locomotion fame, she was their babysitter. And she came along one evening, covered in bruises. And they said, "What on earth happened?" And she said, "Oh, it's my boyfriend. He hit me and it felt like a kiss." So Goffin and King turned that into a song, and it was released. I say it did get an official release. But it was quickly withdrawn. Now, this is where it gets quite interesting, I think, and really tells you a lot about Spector, is that he now needed a follow-up because, that was withdrawn, as I say. And the Crystals weren't available. And he'd already got a song lined up, "He's a Rebel," written by Gene Pitney. But the Crystals weren't available to record it. So what Phil Spector did, he brought Darlene Love, one of his other acts. She had songs with a band called Bobby Sox and the Blue Jeans, and also solo singles with Spector on his label. And she had a backing group called the Blossoms. And on the 13th of July 1962, Darlene Love and the Blossoms recorded "He's a Rebel." Well, when that was released on the 6th and went into the charts on the 6th of October 1962, it was released as a Crystal song. And the first the Crystals heard it, it was when it was being introduced on the radio. And now the latest Crystal single, "He's a Rebel." And then the car going, "What? What's this?" And ironically, it gave him his first American number one. So it was very, very successful. But it just shows, Phil Spector, not really audacity. I mean, it really was the Phil Spector sound. And it just shows there how, they're all great singers, all the lead singers of the various bands. And you got Ike Tina Turner coming up shortly as well, another pretty good singer. So, they really did all complement each other, really, in a way.
Can I say something here? I think
Absolutely.
This is great. I think this, 2 comments here. One is Stephen Mulholland. I hate people who wear rock band T-shirts but never own an album by by that band, that particular band. Now, Stephen also says, R.I.P. to Tony Clarkin, the guitarist with the most underrated rock band in the UK, Magnum. And this one, I know, excuse me, I know we're going off the subject. We're just digressing for
Absolutely.
a moment or two. And it's what Mark Kinnish asks. And he says, Derek, what do you think of the new demo Beatles song last year, Now and Then?
I thought it was very good. I wouldn't say it was one of their absolute classics. And they had been working on it for some years. And apparently it was the state of the current technology that enabled them to actually clean up the old tapes sufficiently to be able to release it as a commercial release. And I mean, it's almost certainly going to be their swan song single. And it's interesting now, of course, when you're in a quiz and the question is, what was the Beatles' last UK number one? It's no longer the ballad of John and Yoko. It's now and then. So, you know, the question is,
I didn't know that the ballad of John and Yoko was the last number one hit.
It was in their lifetime, yeah. Before this one, it was the last hit. Let It Be was, I think Let It Be only got to number 2, I think.
I love that. That's what I mean about having you on. You know, I get to know all these. Well, they're not trivial, really. Yeah. It's not trivial. It's fact. What do you? Can I go to Tony, please? Andy, what do you think of Now and Then by the Beatles?
I totally agree with Derek. I mean, this is someone who I grew up with their soundtrack, so I'm going to love whatever they did. But I have a couple of issues with, not so much with them, but with the way I think music is going now. I kind of like the song, but I saw it really as an album track rather than a single. But they proved us wrong, because, you know, 50 or 60 years down the line, they hit number one again. So I'm glad of that. But I felt that the addition of the AI on the tidy up of John's vocals and stuff like that is leading us down a path of, because we're already into the situation where there's lots of modern pop bands who can't actually sing that great. So they have compressors and digitizers and everything that will balance a voice, make it sound in tune, which to me kind of goes against the grain of music. Because you wouldn't have, you go back to Buddy Holly and you can hear Buddy Holly's demo tapes, and he's in his apartment stuff, and he can still sing and he can still play without all the frills. And then you move that generation forward, and it's only really until we're in modern times where you're not sure if it's real or if it's computer generated. To me, I think that's a sadness with the way music's going. And I totally agree with the quote before. I don't know if it was from Mark about the T-shirts. I've got a wardrobe full of T-shirts of stuff that I love. Some I've never seen live. Jimi Hendrix died a few years before I was able to buy a ticket. But yeah, but in terms of that track, I did enjoy it. I did like it. I did buy it, and I bought it for the kids because our twins, they reached their 22nd birthday almost a day, hit number one. So it's like, that's, you know, remember your birthday with that. But I love everything they've done.
What do you think of Soul Boy Fran there? I was going to call you Phil then. I love Phil Spector production of Sonny Charles and the Checkmates, Proud Mary. Absolutely stunning production. What do you think of that comment?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Phil Spector's done some awesome stuff that, was on albums or on singles. A lot of things that end up as things like Northern Soul now because nobody bought them at the time. I mean, that's a great example. And there's so many other great examples. And just following on from what Anthony was saying there, up until the early 1960s, records were effectively recorded live in the studio. They put a screen around the drummer to stop too much drumming coming out on the guitar tracks, as it were. And they effectively played live. A lot of very famous songs are recorded in 2 or 3 takes. And what they were effectively doing was playing live in the studio. I mean, look at someone like Joe Meek recording in his house, basically. And he'd record sometimes in the hallway and certainly in the bathroom because he'd get better echo effect. And I think, now you've got pitch control and all kinds of stuff. So even I could sound good if I was singing. And singing is not one of my strengths, sadly. I would love to be able to sing. My dad sings.
Well, Anthony's in a band, I don't know whether he's still, I think he's got together now and again, don't you, Anthony?
We do, sadly, not as much as we should do, really.
No.
Kind of more my thing. I walked away to punt around with paintbrushes and stuff, and the music kind of took a second place. But never say never, Frank. I still played, and the lads, there's only a 3-piece of us, but the boys still play as well in different bands and stuff. So it's still there that we'll get out and play.
Okay, well, I just want to mention a couple of comments on the straight back to Derek because this is for him. Gary Rigby says, Now and Then was rejected for the anthology in the 90s, and I can see why it's very forgettable in my opinion. And George Harrison also didn't like it. And Dementia, what a name, Dementia Run. I love the name. I love Motown songs. And Soul Boy. Did Derek mention Lieber Stoller, who wrote a lot of songs for Atlantic?
Oh, that's right. I mean, Phil Spector, when he's working at Atlantic, he was very much working with Lieber and Stoller. I think he got Lester Sill to introduce him to Lieber and Stoller because he moved from the West Coast to the East Coast part of the way through that whole Atlantic thing. But, I mean, by the time you get to 63, you're getting into some of the real classics like the Crystals, the Do Ron Ron, and the Crystals, Then He Kissed Me. And what's interesting with Phil Spector as well, bands sort of die away. And as the Crystals were coming to the end of their life, the Ronettes came onto the scene, and they had their first hit with "Be My Baby," which is.
Here's another question for you, because you're talking about them. Why was it always mostly girl bands he produced?
It's an interesting one, that. I mean, it was almost all girl bands. I mean, Bob B. Sox and the Blue Jeans had Darlene Love as one of the lead singers and another guy whose name escapes me for the moment as the other lead singer. But by and large, the wall of sound really revolves around the Crystals, Ronettes, Darlene Love. And then we get to the second, third stage with the Righteous Brothers, of course, which were a couple of guys. And it cannot go past 1963 without mentioning the Christmas album. Every year now, there are at least 2 or sometimes 3 songs in the British top 100 from that album in 1963. Actually released on the same day as John F. Kennedy's assassination, 22nd of November. Yeah. And Brian Wilson appears on it, the guy from the Beach Boys. He plays piano on a couple of tracks. And Sonny Bono, because Sonny Bono actually worked for Phil Spector. He plays percussion on stuff. He's credited with stuff on various Phil Spector albums. And the last hit the Crystals had was in 64 with a song called I Wonder. And then you got the Ronettes walking in the The Rain. And that was pretty much the end of the Ronettes. We're now at the back end of 1964. And he was looking for the next big thing. And that, of course, was the Righteous Brothers. Bill Medley and Bobby Hatfield, not actually brothers. I mean, they'd been around a time before Phil Spector got involved with them. They released half a dozen or so singles on the Moonglow label. The first one was Little Latin Loopy Loo. And they had no chart success. And then they got involved with Phil Spector. And of course, the Christmas of 1964, You've Lost That Loving Feeling. And one of the biggest songs of all time.
Absolutely.
The BM. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say
that one song just hits every living room, certainly in England. It was just amazing. Just outstanding.
I used to sing that to my girlfriends.
Brilliant. I mean, what a song. The BMI has reported that it's the most played song on radio and television in the 20th century.
Wow.
So, you know, certainly some royalties have been earned from that. But of course, the Righteous Brothers had four, I think, hits with Phil Spector. But a lot of the relationships from here on in sort of end in tears when people are involved with Phil. Because what happened was he decided to Phil Spector decided to add his name to the writing credit for the B-side. And of course, it then gave him a third of the royalties. And the two Righteous Brother guys, Medley and Hatfield, had written it. So they were never really all that happy about that. And they decided that they would move on. And they went to MGM, record label. So Phil Spector promptly sued MGM. So now he's looking for his next new big thing. And that, of course, was Ike and Tina Turner. And another absolute classic.
Yes.
Because they've been together. I mean, Ike Turner is one of the really overlooked guys in rock and roll history. The first rock and roll record's often cited as being Rocket 88, and about 51, I think it's recorded. But it was actually Ike Turner's Kings of Rhythm that had hired the studio at Sun to record that. And Jackie Brenston, sax player, he recorded 2 songs that day. And Ike Turner recorded 2 songs that day. So they put 2 out as Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, Rocket 88 being one of them, and 2 out as Ike Turner and his Kings of Rhythm. And sadly for Ike Turner, the other one went out and put Jackie Brenston into rock and roll history books. And it was very much him that encouraged and started Tina Turner's career. But what's interesting... Sorry.
I'm sorry, I have to come in there because Gary Rigby says Bonnie Joe Mason, Ringo, I Love You, a.k.a. Cher, a classic produced by Spector. I'm going to surprise you here. No, I'm not. You surprised me by saying about Bono. Did he actually produce Sonny and Cher himself? Phil Spector, that is.
Well, Cher was a backing singer on, I think it was River Deep, Mountain High. Okay. And Sonny Bono introduced, it's interesting. No, it couldn't have been River Deep. It must have been earlier than that. I can't remember. She was a backing singer on one or two of the really big ones. And because, Sonny and Cher, Sonny Bono was working closely with Phil Spector all the time. He was on the payroll, basically. Mm-hmm. And so he introduced Cher, and she acted as backing singer. But Phil Spector must never have picked up on her, mustn't have been quite the right place at the right time, because it in a parallel universe somewhere, instead of Ike and Tina Turner, you could imagine Cher would have been able to have handled the same kind of vocal strength as Tina Turner, but it never quite worked out. I mean, Tina Turner came onto the scene. Well, Ike and Tina Turner, although the record does actually separately credit featuring Tina Turner, which I thought was quite nice.
Well, River Deep, as you mentioned, River Deep, Mountain High. that just, Anthony would know this, that just blasted out in Liverpool in every pub you walked into. You couldn't get away from it. It was absolute. It's still brilliant today. It's still, from the puts happen. Go on.
It will fill any dance floor now. And I don't know if it was Phil who did Nutbush City Limits for them, which kind of we got to hear around the same time, River Deep and Nutbush. And all of that stuff at that time will fill any dance floor, probably in any country in the world. And it's version on soul music to heavy metal, because it just takes off the roof.
Yeah, what's really irony is not the right word for it. I mean, now that song is considered right up there with some of the best rock and roll songs of all time. At the time, it was a dismal failure. It marked the end of the Wall of Sound. It crawled into the American charts at number 98. Over the next 4 weeks, it crawled up to number 88. And then the following week, it dropped out of the charts completely. I mean, it was quite a big hit. It was a number 3 in the UK. But in America, for who knows what reason, it really did not click with the record buying public at all. I mean, Spector was devastated by this, and he released a handful of singles after that. The Ronettes' "I Can Hear Music," later covered by the Beach Boys, was actually the last number 1. It only got to 100, and in fact, the very last single. Well, no, in fact, that was. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Derek. Does he? You know the Shirelles at the time,
yeah.
And you mentioned as well, Little Millie. Was it Little Millie? The Locomotion. The Little
Lever.
Little Lever. Little Millie. Anyway, did he produce them? Like the Shirelles and the likes of Little Lever. Did he produce them?
No, he didn't produce them. I think Lieber and Stoller were involved in. Lieber and Stoller did a lot of production as well. They had their own record label for a time called Spark, and that's where the Coasters, I think, started. Well, they were the Robins at that time, I think.
Soulboy friend mentioned that.
Yeah, Phil Spector at that period, he had this sort of small group of art. Well, not too small, I suppose. He produced, hundreds of different singles and tracks and stuff. But what was interesting is, his name was very prominently produced by Phil Spector. And then when you get past River Deep, Mountain High, that last one I just mentioned, the Ronettes, it's actually got on the label producer Jeff Barry, who was one of the writers of the song. And the last ever single was Mike and Tina Turner. I think it's a brilliant song. A Love Like Yours, Don't Come Knocking Every Day was the last single on Phillies. And there's no producer listed at all. So, the River Deep, Mountain High failure really, really made its mark on Phil Spector. And it's so difficult to believe when you look at that song now, just, its place in the sort of rock and roll pantheon. Absolutely incredible.
Do you know? So I get the impression about Phil Spector, to be honest. It's like historically, I'll say this historically, an example historically. I've always said, and I'm actually quoted as saying this when someone's doing essays or whatever, dissertations. Liverpool was the Ellis Islands of Europe, right? Now, do you reckon that Phil Spector was the George Martin of America?
Yeah, I reckon in a sense of, he really was the fifth Beatle. I mean, he was a very, very important part of the Beatles sound. And again, what's interesting is he wasn't a rock and roll producer. He produced jazz, he produced comedy, the Goons, and the likes. And it was really one of his very early ventures into pop music. But I think it was the extraordinary talent that was Lennon McCartney in terms of songwriting. and couple them with George Martin as the producer. You can see how the Beatles developed. Like all the beat groups that started, they were cover bands, and then one or two of the bands started writing their own material, the Beatles being one of the first. And that's one of the really big differences between the first half of the 60s and the second half of the 60s. Rock music came along in 65, 66, with the likes of Cream, Jimi Hendrix in this country, and the Doors, Jefferson Airplane and the like. In America, and that marked a real change to the bands themselves writing most of their own material. And I think Phil Spector has that same kind of aura about him almost. I said it right at the beginning. I mean, you didn't talk about the new Ronette single. You talked about the new Phil Spector single, and he's a rebel. He recorded with one of his groups. And then released it under another of his group's names, and not a particularly well documented fact. That it's completely true, but it comes as a great surprise to a lot of people that it wasn't the Crystals, and I think Phil Spector has really just got to be up there with the best producers that have ever lived. And
what you were talking about there, I've got to mention this. And Scotty Rigby said, I didn't know that failed. This is River Deep Mountain. I didn't know that failed in the States. It's a classic 1966.
Yeah.
And I'll just go on to these still with you. Dementia Runner. Dementia Runner. I think that's making Dementia Runner. Wasn't Phil Spector a bit nuts?
Well, he apparently wasn't the easiest of people to work with. He would just go his own way, as with the using somebody to record it, then calling it.
Well, John Lennon said it though, didn't he? He said he was very hard to work with.
Oh yeah, I mean, just about everybody now. We start talking about Leonard Cohen, the Beatles, because we're now at the end of 1960s when Phil Spector turned the Get Back tapes into the Let It Be album, but pretty much a lot of his ventures then, like the Ramones, Leonard Cohen, they all ended in tears. He was famed for waving guns around. I mean, he eventually went to prison for it. But and you mentioned the John Lennon rock and roll album, which Phil Spector produced for John Lennon during his long weekend. Of 18 months.
I thought that after 18 months, the long weekend, I thought really that was one super album. I really did. I just think it was fantastic and all that.
Oh, it was a good album.
Lennon at his best. That's what I thought.
From the heart, wasn't the songs, and I think the partnership certainly in the beginning of that album was tremendous. And then what went on in the middle with Phil kind of losing it a bit and disappearing with the tapes, and all kind of in hindsight adds to the whole myth of what a great album. But I just want, from my kind of objective on Phil, he seems to be going. What he was inventing was like Picasso or like someone. He was going somewhere where no one else had been before, with his soundscapes, with his production, with the music, was getting bigger and better. And at a point, we mentioned, and a few of our team had mentioned Motown. Now Motown started to kind of dip in and copy their version of what I think was Phil's thing. And it's like any painter, like any musician, that if you produce something that's a wow factor, then somebody's going to copy it. So it seems to have got to a stage where the industry was sampling Phil Spector's creativity, and Phil Spector wasn't either able to or didn't want to compete. No, the punch.
I think that's a crack at that, because I want to pick up on what Derek said before. And he said, when, like, you know, I think you were mentioning the Ronettes at the time, and you said, you know, that it wasn't like, say, a song, I love Frank, right? That's the title of a song, sung by the Ronettes, and yet it'll be I Love Frank, a new Phil Spector production.
Yeah.
You know, and how did they feel? How did the artists feel about Phil Spector being mentioned before the singers? How do you think they felt? Do you think they felt a little bit envious?
They could have done. I think the thing about the whole Phil Spector stable was that it was different to, say, you know, Motown. I mean, interestingly enough, the last ever Phil Spector single was written by Holland Dozier Holland, that A Love Like Yours Don't Come Knocking Every Day. So, you know, you can see that the overlap is very much there. I think if you worked with Phil Spector, you just knew you were working with Phil Spector.
I made up, you said that. I made up. Just bear me out on these. I'm glad you said that. Right, this one. And it's by Gary, actually. He was a perfectionist, of course, which people couldn't handle. Now, John Lennon was a perfectionist, and Paul McCartney, the pair of them were perfectionists. And we've seen that in the Get Back, you know, documentary. Absolutely perfectionists they were. So you can imagine Lennon, you know, because I knew that he argued with Phil Spector quite a lot during that particular album. And Gary carries on by saying he wasn't as nuts as Kim Fowley.
Yeah, it's interesting. Somebody mentioned the Ramones album, End of the Century. That was like 1979. Phil Spector produced the Ramones. And what you're just saying about being a perfectionist, I mean, it really shows, if you look at the stats there. They spent 3 weeks recording it, and then Phil Spector spent 6 months mixing it. It was recorded in May of '79. It wasn't released till the January of 1980. And what I thought was really interesting is one of the tracks on that was the "Baby I Love You," and the Ramones version in the UK, when it came out in 1980, made number 8. When the Ronettes version came out in 1964, it only made number 11. I was quite surprised when I spotted that particular statistic. But what they said was very much, I mean, the Ramones and Spector didn't get on at all. There's talk of being locked in studios, Spector waving a gun around all over the place. And apparently a typical Ramones album would cost about $60,000 to make. And End of the Century, the Phil Spector one, apparently cost $200,000 to make. And the original contract was for 2 albums, but neither Phil Spector nor the Ramones could stomach working with each other anymore. But it was exactly what you were saying about being a perfectionist. What really got annoyed the Ramones was the constant retakes and the constantly doing the same thing over and over again. So I think the Ramones gives a great example of that side of Phil Spector.
Derek, time's up. I'm awfully sorry.
Oh, there's so much to talk about. No, it's great. I really enjoyed it, Frank.
No, I'd love you to carry on about Phil Spector, but do you know what I'd like you to talk about? I think everybody agrees. You know, it's about a producer, and I think everybody will agree that when you talk about George Martin, all you're associating with is the Beatles. Because you talk about Phil and George the next time you're on.
About George Martin?
Yes, please.
Yeah, no problem at all.
The pair of them, and some of the bands as well.
Sorry, who else as well as George Martin, Frank?
No, I'm just saying some of the bands that they actually produced, because
yeah.
there's, I just let me go through a couple of, Mark Kearney says, I think Phil Spector worked with John Lennon on the Imagine album, right? That's what he says.
Yeah.
And
he worked a few times with Lennon.
Right, he wasn't the right guy for the Ramones, who were basically a garage punk. That's what Gary Rigby says. Soulboy says, I think Motown was more about the house band, the Funk Brothers, rather than the production.
Yeah.
And
because you've got the Wrecking Crew, of course, working with Phil Spector. Similar kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. So, some of the bands as well.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd love to. Do you know what? I can't think of the bloody band now, and I was going to ask you for the next time. Can I get hold of you? Can Jason get hold of you and mention a band it's from the 60s, by the way?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll tell you who it is. Am I getting mixed up now? I thought I might be getting. It's that dementia thing. It's a dementia runner. There's a. Blimey, the Trogs, is it? No, he was out with. Bloody hell! Who sang Wild Thing? Was it the Trogs?
That's the Trogs, yeah.
Was you talk about them?
Trogs, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, brilliant! So that's Phil Spector. Carry on with his thing, his biography, right? And also George Martin. I'd like you to compare the two of them, if you don't mind, besides the Beatles, that is, with George Martin in particular, and also the Trogs, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. That'd be good fun.
And I'll tell you another fella, that's him, Scott McKenzie.
Oh, yeah, he's a great guy.
Please, will you talk about them then next time?
Right.
I'm sorry, it's a whole show. And we'll have you on in the second half along with Anthony. Is that all right? So that'll be 2 hours.
Okay.
You don't mind that?
No problem at all, mate.
So in a couple of weeks, I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Oh, Derek, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I just can't believe this. Mark Simons, let's just... Dementia runner says, don't be blaming me. Great, isn't it? And Gary Rigby says, the Trogs were brilliant.
Absolutely.
And Mark Simons says, fed out paranoid after the Manson murders and took guns everywhere, even shooting in the studio with John Lennon, after which John cries out, I need my ears, Phil. And how happens the rose he took it away. It's just absolutely nuts, isn't it? These are great comments. Motown was big in the 80s as well as in Liverpool, says Dementia Runner. And Trogs tapes were funny, the studio outtakes, yeah. Mm. Did he sing Slipping on a Slide, Lennon, on that album?
I can't remember, to be honest. I think he did.
Because did he? That's brilliant. I found it on YouTube. It's brilliant. And he's singing it live.
Yeah.
Why did I do that? I don't know. I pretend that that's a mic. I should just pull that over. But Derek, thank you so much. So, if that's okay, you and Anthony for 2 hours. Is that okay?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much. And I can't wait for those things, you'll be talking about as well. And I suppose some of the people on here will ask about certain bands and whatever, if that's okay.
Yeah, fine. Absolutely.
Excellent stuff. Thank you so much, Derek. And
my pleasure.
Just hang around for a couple of minutes, because honestly, just hang around. And there's a little break, and I'll see you after the break.
Okay.
And here's what Jason's putting up.